So Joseph Campbell tells us, and I'll read as well, traditionally the first function of a living mythology is to reconcile consciousness to the preconditions of its own existence. That is to say, the nature of life. Life is a horrendous presence, and you wouldn't be here if it weren't for that. A mythological order has been set to reconcile consciousness to this fact. Did I read the right one? Yes, I did. The third function of mythology order is to validate and maintain a certain sociological system, a shared set of rights and wrongs, properties, on which a particular societal unit depends for its existence. So basically what myth does is it gives us a sense of perspective, where we are to the cosmos and where we are to the tribe, to the culture. It gives us a sense of belonging, but also gives us an alarm, as this quote says. It realizes that we are very small in a huge universe which we know very little about. And it's better to start going forward with the stories of who we are, the stories of our tribe and our culture and others, so that we may find answers. Again, it weaves in and out of science, of art, of literature, of philosophy. It holds them all together, and it really does fuel them because it is part of the dream of who we are. It was, I actually did a show very recently on Star Trek, and I'll be bringing up the great myths that are Star Trek. Other great forms of myth today we have is comic books, and I'll be mentioning some of them, why comic books are some of the great myths of our day. It was the very Gnostic-minded William Blake, well, he was pretty much a full Gnostic if you start reading his poetry and his life, who said, what was once imagined is now reality. It has to start somewhere, deep in the unconscious, deep in our desire to understand where we stand with the cosmos and our tribe. And myths is the beginning of that. The word imagination comes from the Latin for shifting images. The Gnostics always believed, and they wrote in a lot of their works, that through the image you enter the truth. What the truth is really is personal for what you find. But through these shifting images, we can find the truth. We can find where we are and where we belong and where we should be going. So back to the Matrix. Now the Matrix itself, as I mentioned, is a myth. On the surface, it's a great entertaining story, an action-packed adventure. But underneath, it's a lot more than that. After all, and as I mentioned, there are scientists who believe that we are living in the Matrix. Right now we're being coded. There are certainly people who've taken the Matrix as a sort of pseudo-religion. The impact on our culture has been great. Special effects, fashion, the cell phone, and other things has been immense. But underneath, it's a very powerful allegory about how we have become really slaves to machines. It may not be true, but we are very dependent on our machines, and our machines today are pretty much draining our lives. I don't think they knew about smartphones in 1999 when the movie came out, but as you can see, we are becoming so increasingly dependent, and as some people have said, that they are sapping our humanity, they are draining our humanity. So in a sense, the Matrix is a very powerful myth. It does encompass science, religion, philosophy. It does encompass a lot of parts of our culture, like fashion, attitude, and so forth. Something about Keanu Reeves, he happens to appear in a lot of Gnostic-themed movies, and I'll get into that for now. So the next, we're going to talk about religion. Joseph Campbell had the famous quote, "Religion is myth misunderstood." When we are doing the ritual, we're actually reenacting the myth. And somehow, somewhere down the line, and as always happens, people want to control, because he who controls the myth really controls the culture. As you've seen from the movie before and the work of Sean and Fritz, I myself am part of the Mythicist camp. And this contends that basically Jesus, and really all other great figures, probably were never historical. They were actually part of a mythical narrative. There are different views on the mythicist case. For example, that Jesus and his apostles are simply taken from the stars, as which we call astrotheology. the 12 apostles, Jesus as the Son of God, S-U-N. And these stories before basically became carnalized. They were in the old days we didn't have TV or smartphones, so people would look at the stars and they would create these great stories. And these stories were inspirational, again, gave the tribe perspective, but were also great in finding the timing of the crops and the changings of the seasons. Of course, there are other mythicist views that Jesus may be just a patchwork character of Old Testament characters that was created, again, as people were trying to entertain, as a new religion was coming up. They sort of worked their way backward and created from Ezekiel, from Moses, they created this great new sort of religious character for a future, for the religion that was coming out. Same can be said with Buddha, Muhammad, and you see this in the work of great mythicist scholars like Richard Carrier, Acharya S, Robert Price, Timothy Freak, and some others. And very much like the Gnostics, which I'll get into, the Gnostics are probably some of the most hated movements of all time. I mean, it didn't matter who. Christianity tried to destroy them. The Buddhists and other Asian cultures tried to destroy them. Muslims hated the Gnostics whenever they came, and so forth. Really, one of the most hated minorities are the mythicists today. Something, obviously, theists can't stand mythicists because the act of talking about Jesus as a myth is just insulting, which of course is more of a modern construct as fundamentalism really rises in our country and takes hold. C.S. Lewis had no problem thinking of Jesus as a myth. He called him the myth that has come alive, the myth that is true. Martin Luther King himself wrote about how Jesus was based on old myths. He was already doing the stuff that we are doing and other scholars are doing in the 50s. Even before that, St. Augustine once said, Christianity has always existed. Why would he say that? Because he knew that Jesus was just part of this amazing literary narrative that was going throughout history. But again, this has been lost. And it seems that as I've talked to many scholars and friends with the atheist movements also does not like the idea of Jesus being a myth. I don't know, it's because, nobody wants to fight over a story or a fiction. Nobody's going around arguing about Hercules or anything like that. And it's gotten pretty bad. It's almost like there's been a very small civil war going on in the free thought community. You had Bart Ehrman, who lashed out with his book, Was There a Historical Jesus? And he started slamming other scholars, secular scholars, and a lot of these scholars have hit back. And you have this ongoing civil war within the atheist movement. So being a mythicist is not easy, it's hard. And it continues, but the work must be continued so that when we realize that we're dealing with myths and stories, it becomes more liberating and you allow these things to flow and grow. And in essence, it's sort of a seed society to have better crops as people, as cultures, as countries. And as far as Jesus goes, as I was saying, Jesus is not only based on Old Testament characters or the processions of the sun or the stars, but there are parallels with other God-men. We have the great myth of the rising and dying God-man. Who is this God-man? Well, this God-man represents many things, and he's been known as Osiris, Dionysus, some Mithras, although that's debatable, and Horus, and many other gods that came before Jesus, and some after Jesus, like Odin was crucified in a lot of the Norse myths. Although, in defense of Christianity, it seems that this myth came after, or the myth of Krishna being crucified has also happened before, but that probably happened as Christianity and other religions were interbreeding.